what do you think about Trumponomics? Trumponomics is whatever can get us to 3% growth. And I can assure you, when I am in the Oval Office with the President and we're talking about trade policy, we're talking about energy policy, we talk about tax policy, we talk about health care reform, we talk about budgets, we're trying to figure out a way to get to 3% growth. I have news for you, both parties. If we do not get to 3% growth, it is unlikely we'll ever balance the budget again. And that is not a plan. That is not a plan for the future. That is not moral, to continue to take money from people without having a plan to pay it back. So we do everything we can to try and get to 3% growth. I look forward to the questions today about how we do that. We do all of this, by the way, and still fund the President's priorities. You've heard it by now. We wanted more money for national security, border security, law enforcement, veterans, school choice, even paid parental leave. For the first time ever, President Trump, the first president of either party, is proposing a national paid parental leave program. We have $20 billion in this budget to do that. We don't touch Social Security and Medicare, following through on his campaign promises. And we're able to do all of that and still balance. Why? Because what we did here is try and change the way that Washington looks at spending. We no longer want to measure compassion by the number of programs that we have or the number of people that are on those programs. We want to measure compassion, true compassion, by the number of people we help to get off of those programs. We don't want to measure our commitment to the country by the amount of money that we spend, but instead on the number of people that we help get off of these programs and get back in charge of their own lives. That is what we think makes this the American greatness budget, because we're going to try and get the country back to where we have a healthy economy, people are working again, people are optimistic about the country again. I remind you, if you're under the age of 30, you have never had a job as an adult in a healthy American economy. And a healthy American economy is very, very different than what you've seen for the last 10 years. And the dynamism and the optimism that comes from that is what this administration is about. It's what this president promised. It's what we're going to do everything in our power to deliver, and the budget is a start to that. So with that, Madam Chairman, again, thank you for having me today. I look forward to the questions and in explaining the budget to the members.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you for yielding back those 5 minutes, and our members will have more time and opportunity to ask you questions. And so now we will begin the question and answer period, and I'm going to begin with the first question. You mentioned during your opening comments about a moral obligation of balancing the budget, and around here in Washington, you'll hear some folks say this is just kind of a quaint anachronism, that we should balance a budget, that somehow that would not be something that would be very important. And you mentioned about it being a moral obligation. I certainly, as a mother and a grandmother, and hopefully a grandmother, great-grandmother someday, do feel that it is our moral obligation to make sure that we leave a strong country without huge deficits for our children and grandchildren. And so will you talk a little bit more about your view on the fiscal and economic well-being and what will happen if we continue these chronic budget deficits and ever-rising debt on the moral issue for the future generations?
Sure. I'll approach it this way. Thank you, Chairman Black. Everybody around this table owes the federal government $60,000. I have 3 17-year-olds. Okay? They're not even out of school yet, and they owe this government $60,000 each. Every man, woman, and child in this room owes the federal government $60,000. I'm not sure if they know that. I'm not sure if we've done a good job as both parties of explaining to people what government truly costs. In fact, I happen to believe we've done a really good job of hiding the cost, the true cost of government from the American people. Yep. I don't believe that people are willing to pay for as much government as they have. And I don't think that we've been entirely honest with them for about the last 40 years on what government truly costs. And I do think there's a moral imperative to tell them, to say, look, this is how much it costs, and this is how much we have to take from you in order to do this. Do you really want us to take from you that much money? Or do you want us to try and find a way to balance and to spend less? And balance is something that it seems foreign in this city, which completely stuns me. I don't know how many of you used to be on the state legislatures. I was. I know that Governor Sanford was when he was my governor in South Carolina. But a balanced budget was the ordinary course of business for just about everybody in the world except this body. States have to do it. Families have to do it. Businesses have to do it. I mean, my goodness, my church has to balance its budget, or else they cease to function. And I think there's a disconnect between the American people and the government when we don't lay out a path to balance. When you talk about the financial impact of that, Madam Chairman, what you look at as we go forward is every single year we talk about more and more of our money going to pay interest payments on the debt. And I don't know the exact numbers, but at some point in the very near future, we expect to be paying more money for debt than we do for defense. And that worries me. I was in, not this room because this is a temporary room, but I was in the old budget room my very first year when I saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sit in front of this committee and say that he thought the greatest threat to this nation was the national debt. Great countries are not destroyed from without, they rot from within. And that debt, that crushing debt that we have on every man, woman, and child is part of that rot, and that's what we're trying to address in a very candid, open, and honest way in this budget.
And I do appreciate that. And I appreciate you putting it in a context as well, that we would look at our students in high schools and say to them, would you like to have a $60,000 car? Or would you like to just pay your share of the debt to the federal government? So I appreciate putting it in a real context where folks understand that when we talk about trillions of dollars, I know even before I came here to Congress and serving in the state legislature, we talked about millions and billions. We don't talk about trillions of dollars as state legislators. And honestly, you sometimes think that's a fictional amount, because people cannot wrap their heads around trillions of dollars. But when you put it in a real context of your share of that is $60,000, and you're really, at the end of the day, not paying off even the debt that we're continuing to build up. Along with that, I do want to say it's gratifying to see that the administration is taking a stand on some federal entitlement programs and reforming them. Do you consider entitlement reform an indispensable part of reaching that balanced budget, especially as we look at how we're only spending 1/3 of our total dollars on everyday spending, and the rest of it is over in that column with the debt and the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and the other entitlement programs. So do you consider that an indispensable part of what we must be doing? And along with that, do you agree that even if we weren't facing a fiscal crisis, that reforming these entitlement programs really is the right thing to do?
Let me answer it this way, Chairman. I don't believe it's possible. In fact, I know it's not possible to balance the budget solely using the discretionary portion of the budget. There have been years that I was here, 2010, 2011, I believe, where we could have taken discretionary spending to at or near zero, and we still would have had a deficit. In our budget, we do address mandatory spending, what some people call entitlement spending, but we do not address the two that the President simply didn't want to touch, which was Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. I've told the story many times. I actually sat across the desk from him in the Oval Office with my list of mandatory reforms, and at the end of, I think we had 4 meetings on it, he would go, yes, yes, no, 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 and the no's were all Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. And when I pressed him on that, he said, look, I made a promise. I made a promise to people that I would not touch those, and we didn't. And I'll be perfectly frank with you and candid, I didn't think we could balance the budget. And that's why I was extraordinarily impressed with my team when they were able to figure out a way to balance the budget without touching those things. I will tell you, it's probably the last time we could do that. It'd be very difficult in the future to do that because of the role that those programs do play in our future spending. But I was excited to be able to keep the President's promise. By the way, the budget is nothing more than a collection of his promises. That's how we wrote it. If he said he wanted to spend more money on something during the campaign, we spend more money here. If he said he wanted to spend less, we spent less here. He said he wanted to add to defense, he wanted to add to border security, wanted to add to school choice and Veterans Affairs, but didn't want to add to the deficit in year one. That's the framework for the budget. But to your larger point, yeah, you cannot address our long-term drivers of our debt without looking at the mandatory side of the budget. It's 3/4 of what we spend, going to 80% in the near future. So yeah, you would be hard-pressed to be able to balance the budget without looking at mandatory spending.
And along those lines, and I'll conclude my questions here, but along those lines, we sat and talked privately about some of the ideas that you had, and you shared with me that we don't want to hurt people who really need the kinds of services that we want to be sure they get. In other words, we don't want somebody who is unable to afford their heat and air conditioning to go without getting those services. But there are wastes in these programs, and I think that's important that we talk about the wastes in the programs at the same time acknowledging that we're not heartless people. We want to make sure we take care of people, but we also want to make sure our dollars are well spent. Would you give an example of it just in the LIHEAP program about how there are wastes that we need to make sure that we're cleaning up?
Sure. And I know it fits a certain narrative that our party doesn't care about poor people, and that seems to always filter out during budget time. In fact, it filters out all the time. I believe in the social safety net. I really do. I actually think that it helps us get to that 3% growth, and I've made that exact argument to the President, that a healthy social safety net gives people that confidence that we need them to have in order to take risks, in order to start your own business, in order to go out on your own, to bring the sort of dynamism that we need into the economy to get 3% growth, and that a healthy safety net is part and parcel of that. And we can absolutely afford to do that for folks who really need it. Part of the difficulty, I think, and we'll talk about this, I know, as we go through the various programs, though, is are there folks who are on these programs who shouldn't be? And again, when we have a chance to go into more detail, I will answer your specific question about LIHEAP. 11,000 dead people got this benefit a few years ago. Dead people. One of your states, I can't remember which one it is, has a requirement that they approve 3/4 of the applications, regardless of merit. When you look at that through the perspective of the folks who pay for the program, it's an entirely different perspective than, oh my goodness, you're going to put people out on the street, or people are going to freeze to death. No, they aren't. We are not going to kick any deserving person off of any meaningful program. We want to help people just as much as you do. Republicans care about poor people as much as Democrats, just the same as we care about clean air and healthy drinking water. But we look at it from a different perspective, which is to balance those who receive the benefits with the folks who pay for the benefits. And when you show me a program where 11,000 dead people are getting benefits, I have a problem with that, because I think taxpayers would as well. And I look forward to having those conversations as we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And I now recognize Mr. Yarmouth for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Black and Director Mulvaney. Nice to see you. Welcome back to the committee, and thank you for your work. The first thing I want to do today is thank you, because one of the things that I think you've done by submitting this budget to Congress is highlight some incredibly important, vital programs and investments that the federal government makes that help working families throughout this country and that support much of the economy in this country. You know, it's one thing to say, well, we can do without CPB, we can do without NEA, we can do without NEH, we can do without CDBG, and people just hear initials and they don't really know what we're talking about. But when they say, would you like arts programs in your community? Would you like historical displays in your rural community? Would you like Meals on Wheels to help your seniors survive? Then they understand that these are critical programs that are worthy of government investment. So I thank you for highlighting that for the American people. And I just have to respond to one thing. That guy who's would decide whether to buy a $60,000 car or pay $60,000 to the government, I wonder what he would answer if you said you can have a $60,000 car or your senior parent can come live with you, because the money that would put her or him in a nursing home that is paid for by Medicaid is not going to be available to you. I think you probably get a little bit different perspective on that. And Mr. Mulvaney, you said on several occasions that you could not ask a single mother, I think you said in Detroit, but it obviously doesn't matter where that single mother would be, whether she would be willing to pay for her share of public television or NEA and so forth. And I would say most single mothers that I would know, if you asked them whether they would pay $1 for $1 a year for children's programming, or would they rather pay $2,000 a year for their share of the defense budget, they wouldn't have any problem paying that $1 for children's programming, but they might balk a little bit at a $2,000 payment for defense. So what we're really talking about in this budget, I think, is this is the age-old guns guns versus butter argument, and I think we'll continue to have that debate, and I think it's really unfortunate in a way, and I thank Ms. Jayapal for that impressive rendition of my opening statement, but this really is pitting one against the other, this budget. That's what it does. It pits defense investment against investment in everything else. And that's a frightening concept, I think, for this country, if we have to ignore the portion of the federal budget that invests in people, whether it's job training, education, important medical research and other innovation, or whether we buy guns. But that's what we're being asked to do in this budget. So, you've justified many of the cuts in this budget by saying that there's no evidence to prove that these programs actually work. For example, you've suggested that Meals on Wheels doesn't work. I would think that just by nature of the fact that you're keeping people alive by feeding them is pretty good evidence. But beyond the question of morality of providing meals to seniors, there's abundant evidence that it does work, including evidence that even small increases in that program pay dividends in the form of lower Medicaid spending. Granted, there are many other programs where the evidence may be more nuanced, but that doesn't mean the programs don't work and should be eliminated, pulling the rug out from working people, children, and the elderly who need them. So if direct empirical evidence that something works is the only standard for funding, then what is the direct empirical evidence that an additional submarine or one more F-35 increases our security? That kind of evidence would be difficult, if not impossible, to produce. Does that mean we shouldn't buy submarines or F-35s? No, of course not. We rely on a comprehensive body of information, including opinions of our military leaders and national security and foreign policy experts, to make those decisions. So the administration is asking for an additional $54 billion above the caps, and there's been plenty of evidence and reports indicating waste and mismanagement at the Pentagon, including it's the only agency that can't pass an audit. There have been hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons system cost overruns, reports of significant bloat in the overhead. The Defense Business Board concluded $125 billion in savings over 5 years could be achieved. GAO has identified a myriad of high-risk management areas in DoD's business operations. And just this past weekend, the Washington Post reported on gross overpricing of fuel in DoD, which created billions of dollars in reserve cash for the Pentagon to spend on new priorities. So my question to you is, how have these reports of mismanagement and waste factored in the administration's decision to add $54 billion for national defense?
A couple of different things to that, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and thank you for the questions. On the DoD, a couple of things. I'm just as interested as you are, I believe, in waste at the Department of Defense, and I'm happy to announce, once I got over to OMB, I started asking questions about what we were going to do about that, and I'm told by the DoD, in fact, I think they just filed a confirmation of this a couple of weeks ago, that they intend to be fully audit ready by September of this year.